So first of all, thank you so much to the entire health tech team for having me today. I am so thrilled to be here with you guys and have the opportunity to see some wonderful leaders in our space, all in this virtual room. I know it's so different having a virtual space versus that in-person, energy where we're really vibing off one another. Nonetheless, super excited to be here. I know we have such a diverse group of leaders as part of this event, and it truly brings me joy to have the opportunity to create an impact with you. So thank you for having me. And just a little about me before we dive in. I know you guys probably did your homework, and a few of you have even connected with me on LinkedIn and introduced yourself, and I'm so excited to see everyone here and have the opportunity to connect with you. But I am, believe it or not, a 16-year marketing and business consultant turned leadership coach and author. And, I sit on the board of an amazing organization called Tech Shift Alliance. I also partner with different groups in the healthcare and tech industry, particularly within femtech. I'm super passionate about that. And I've had the opportunity from a marketing and business consulting standpoint to work with a variety of healthcare brands. And what I have discovered, the reason why I'm even here, is I am super passionate about the people that make us do what we do. We can promote our technologies all day long. We can know that we're making an impact, but ultimately it comes down to how the people that are our engine are really functioning at the end of the day. So that is what I am passionate about. And today what I want to talk to you about is a little bit different, I know, than probably definitely some of the sessions we've had. I know we've had a lot of focus on the technology itself and kind of where we're going as an industry, but man, I love people, and I'm bringing the energy today. So I hope you've had your coffee. I know I've had a couple of coffees myself. I've been known to be a little bit of a pocket cheerleader, so definitely buckle up for the energy as we kind of head into the later part of this morning. Really what we are going to focus on today for me is the leadership aspect within the innovation space, which of course health tech absolutely is. We're all innovators here. And I want to do this using a framework that many of us are familiar with, because helping to shape that next generation of leaders within healthcare is something I think is incredibly important. We're in the middle of a major shift in the workplace, so no better time than now. We are hearing about the impact of hybrid work. We are experiencing integrations when we're talking about different systems that we have to learn and make sure are included. We're talking about intergenerational dynamics and the clashing of value systems, which I talk a lot about in my book, Leadership Lessons from a Team Captain. And those are just a few examples of the very many factors causing this shift that we're seeing in our space. And as leaders, we are charged with understanding these factors and actively demonstrating greater empathy as we innovate with our teams and grow as businesses. And so, how many of you, before we get into why this matters, how many of you feel empathy is important as leaders at work? I think there's a chat here, and I'd love to see your answers in the chat. If not, virtually raise your hand, and let's just pretend I can see your hand raised. How many of you feel empathy is important as leaders at work? Yeah, so for those of you who put your virtual hand up, you are not alone. Research on the state of workplace empathy shows that more than 90%, that's 90% of CEOs, HR professionals, and employees would agree that empathy is important. Yet there is a huge gap in how empathy is actually perceived, particularly when we're thinking about between employees and executive leadership. But we're in healthcare here, we're in technology here. We know about empathy, right? So how can this gap exist even in our industry, where we're known for loving and caring about the patients that we're impacting and the businesses that do that, right? How many of you were impacted by the pandemic? Let's just take a step back, do a virtual hand raise again if you were impacted by the pandemic. Whether, maybe you lost your job, or you were put on furlough, or experienced some sort of career setback during the pandemic. Is that hitting you in your feels? So many of us had that experience where things were seemingly fine one day, and the next day, our entire livelihood was put on the line or taken away from us. More than probably any other time in history, we looked to our employers and our leaders to give us some sort of security and promise that we were going to be okay. And when many didn't deliver, we felt personally let down. And for me, this was the beginning of quarantine in March of 2020, which, gosh, that seems like yesterday, but apparently was almost 2 years ago. But at the time, I was working for a company who did everything to assure us that we were in a strong position to last months in the event that we needed to shut down operations. We were going to be okay for months. And for 2 weeks up to that point, again, this is March of 2020, for 2 weeks, we had watched the news. We held regular meetings as an office on where we stood as an organization. And I really appreciated that, because I was hearing of a lot of people who were losing their jobs, and I was scared. I could not afford to lose my job at the time, but I did overnight. I went from feeling confident in what my employer was saying to me to being notified the next day that I was immediately being put on furlough with 100 other coworkers, colleagues of mine. And when I look back, it wasn't just this fact that let me down, right? Because I know so many businesses were forced to make a really hard decision that they couldn't possibly have planned for. But it was how my leadership team went about it and navigated this worldwide event that I felt was missing such a key element of human empathy in leadership. And how many can relate to some aspect of this experience? Another virtual hand raise if that was you. And perhaps the impact of the pandemic didn't impact your job security in the same way. Perhaps you've had a boss or a coworker who created an environment that you ultimately didn't feel served your mental or physical health. So, bad stress, and I say bad stress because there's different types of stress that we can have, right? There's good stress that can motivate us, but there's bad stress out there that does not serve our bodies or our mental health. There are things like feeling talked down to, feeling like you had no say in the decisions being made, or no life balance. If you weren't able to relate to my pandemic story, perhaps one of these is your experience. Another virtual hand raise if that's you. And I'm assuming there's some out there because I can't see you. But, I believe that this tension of needing more empathetic-based leadership has existed for a really long time, certainly at least for the last 40 years, when what we know as knowledge work made its debut. In knowledge work, we're using our minds way more than we're using our physical bodies as the labor itself. And as innovators, we're using sticky notes and problem solving instead of a hammer and nails. And the shift that this has caused over time is that we now have this increased need and appropriation for things like flexible work hours and mental rest and balance in our day to promote that mental health because of the exhaustive use of our minds. And this has been going on for decades. It's not new. But at the same time, technology has continued to increase and fight for our attention. And so it becomes this circular tug and pull of greater possibility and increased exhaustion. And what happened for many during the pandemic is that we were forced to stop quite suddenly, if I'm allowed to say that, quite suddenly. And it wasn't until the pandemic that we woke up and we started paying attention to what empathy in the workplace really meant and how exactly it impacts us, both short term and definitely in the long term, not just as people, but as businesses. We're seeing the great resignation right now across industries for this very reason. Right now, the world is still grappling with the pandemic and its impacts, the economic uncertainty, the pressure of mental and physical well-being. We have increased knowledge and accountability around systemic inequality, all underscored by a public health crisis and growing social justice movements. That stresses me out just thinking about it. All of these events that have been occurring right in front of us, though, every day for decades, culminated to where we are finally recognizing the need to embrace a stronger focus on empathy for the well-being of those around us and also for ourselves in the workplace. And more importantly, as part of our decision-making, as we build teams when it comes to the leadership that we're exuding. So what does this have to do with us as innovators? Well, when I think about this, the whole premise of this event today and how we can leverage technology to change and impact the healthcare industry, that's exactly what an empathetic approach to leadership delivers. When we think about how we can use technology, innovation processes, and approaches like design thinking, it absolutely has an application. But there's a gap in understanding what that actually looks like in practice. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of my talk that more than 90% of leaders and professionals believe that empathy is important. And yet, even now, even after what we collectively experienced during the pandemic, there is still this huge gap between what is perceived and what is experienced. And that's where we get what's called this empathy gap, where a divide exists between what we intend as leaders and what our teams actually expect and need from us. But why? I want you to take just a minute, and if you're able to see the other folks on the screen here, just take a browse, look around. If you're able to see who else has joined the event, look up, look down, look to the person to your right, or all over the screen. Just get a sense of how many different folks are on this call today, okay? Data says that 76% of us on this event or at this event believe that empathetic workspaces inspire more motivated employees. Yet only half of us, so 50% or so, who are leaders, believe that empathy drives productivity and motivation, and still somehow the math is jaded, or we are jaded, because 82% of leaders believe that financial performance is tied to empathy. So let's think about this. We believe empathy is important to the bottom line. We know it drives cultural and sustainable leadership. We know it allows us to perform at higher levels and innovate better, but we miss the mark in getting there. We do institute some programs, don't get me wrong. We offer benefits, health benefits, mental health benefits, workout benefits. There's all kinds of benefits. We offer holidays, we do events, we do giveaways, and the list goes on. And all of these intend to showcase our empathy as leaders and as organizations. But at the end of the day, there is a huge breakdown that ultimately creates demotivation, it hinders creativity, and it causes us to lose employees. Turnover has never been higher than it is right now. This is the gap that we must solve for as leaders, particularly if we expect to create any change in our industry. Because the output of our teams, their creativity, starts with us as leaders and creating a psychologically safe space, an inclusive space, a space where we embody empathy. And again, there is a gap in what we think we're doing as leaders and what employees are actually experiencing. Science even backs up the importance of this. When we feel safe, the part of our brain that is creative is allowed to do its thing. It can party, right? When we feel anxious or fearful, the creative part of our brain actually shuts off and we go into protection mode. So when you create a safe space where your team trusts you, you actually create more effective teams. And luckily, I believe that I've uncovered, or at least, rediscovered, it's not a new philosophy, but it is kind of hidden in the weeds, and I'm bringing it back to life. I think that as innovators, we can think about this through the language that we use and know very well and use every day. And that's through this framework of design thinking. And so design thinking, if you haven't seen this model, it looks something like this, what you see on the screen. There are several models out there that define what design thinking looks and feels like as a product innovation process. And all include some form of iteration, collaboration, prototyping, and creativity. But regardless of which model you are working with as a designer and a developer, they all start with understanding the human that we are serving. A core tenet of design thinking requires that we embody empathy at the onset of product development to really understand the end user's needs, their values, their behaviors, and so forth, so that we can either fail and learn or get it really right and build on. And I can't help but think about how we design for people as innovators, as a job where we're building product as solutions, but we don't always require the same approach of ourselves. And when designing solutions for our teams, what I see is that this feeds disconnects. It often causes friction and it really fuels demotivation. And when it comes to teams, there is this expectation that is created by executive leadership that teams are then expected to just fall within, right? We have goals, we have modalities of working, we're told how to conduct our meetings, and the list goes on. There's a lot that goes into our day, right? And it may not always align with the teams who need to meet those expectations. Virtual hand raise if you've ever received a memo from leadership about new policies or processes and thought to yourself how the solution maybe didn't make sense for you and your team, or maybe you had a better idea that had a lot more impact. I think all of us at some point in our career have had that experience. Let's think of it this way. When we're developing products and new technologies, we are stuck in this middle place where users want or need one thing, but we as sales teams and business owners want something else. And sometimes we kind of hodgepodge a connection between the two that isn't natural. And we end up with an idea that doesn't work before we've even done our user research. It's a perfect example of what happens when goals don't line up between the visionary, so executive teams, and the end user. And in our case, that would be us or our teams. And as innovators in tech, understanding the mutually beneficial outcomes for all parties in the experience is important to our success, which is discovered through user research and understanding the people that we are designing solutions for. We don't tell our users what they want from us. We don't tell them what they need. The mutually beneficial part is where that magic happens. And I believe developing our teams as leaders is no different and should have no different of an expectation. So I have a framework here that we'll walk through today for development, team development, that is derived from design thinking. And we'll look at that in just a moment. But let's first look at the layers or the different elements that go into it. For me, design thinking has 3 layers as part of every innovation, sprint, workshop, and iteration of the product. We have the environment, our first layer here. And usually this looks something like a whiteboard covered in sticky notes. I have a window in the other room that is completely covered in sticky notes. And it's sort of this beehive of activity, so to speak. It's the energy around us. It's what comes alive around us as we develop. And sometimes there are people around us as well who are capturing data, they're capturing conversations and insights in real time to help us add that dimension to our creativity. But it's the space we're in that's sending external signals to our bodies, fostering the creativity and this emotional safety as we innovate and do our thing. Another layer to this design thinking process is the approach itself. And this is the path from discovery to then building that solution. This can look different depending on the model that you're following. And as I mentioned earlier, there are several, but it usually starts all in the same place. So empathy, and then moves into solution building. And we'll unpack that here in just a moment. And the last layer at play with design thinking is the people, which of course you heard me say I'm very passionate about. And that's because I believe it really is the most important layer in our process. Because the people are the common denominator, irrespective of process, environment, or whether the problem is business or technical that we're solving for. The people are our through line. They are what give us purpose and function in this world. Getting the people part right is absolutely critical to our success. So with design thinking, we have this process, we have this methodology with an environment, an approach, and people all at play. And really what it's about is bringing people together and enabling them to get on the same page, because if our end user, so our people, our teams, are not on board with whatever process we are putting in place or new policy or new tech stack, if they're not on board and it's not serving their need, our road to success is going to be a very long one, my friends. And that's design thinking for us as leaders. That's how we should look at developing our teams. So let's take a look at this model through the lens of team development and unpack it just a little bit. If we look at Nielsen-Norman Group's model, we have the traditional 5 stages of innovation here, underpinned by the progression from understanding to exploration and then into materializing. And we start with people, and then we move into output. So let's unpack the 5 stages at a high level today. And I say high level because, man, I could do this for days. I get really amped about it. And there's so much to talk about, but we'll do it at a high level today and do what we can. So step 1 of the process is when it's all about empathy, right? It's when we are seeking qualitative and quantitative information to really understand our teams. And here is where we are looking to understand what's making them tick. Whether it's a situation that you are starting from a blank canvas to identify areas of growth for your team, or whether you're looking to improve a specific area that you've already defined, starting with the team that you are serving is a critical first step to ensure a smooth implementation of whatever solution you come up with. And you can use your standard qualitative and quantitative mix. There are a lot of great methods that I can, of course, explore with you after today's event. But it's important that we're looking at the people as a whole to really understand things like cultural influences on their expectations and how they manage their emotions, and and so forth. There's a lot that goes into us as a human, and we have to look beyond just how can someone build a product or ideate. We have to look at who they are at their core to really understand what we can provide as leaders. And like I said, we only have so much time today, but this is an area that really can take weeks to months to develop and really dive in. In fact, I give entire trainings that dive further into this very topic alone through another framework where I walk through exercises of value system exploration and motivator exploration and triggers so that we can really understand what is at the core of our people and ourselves as leaders, understanding our biases and our own emotion management, right? And today is just a snapshot of this, but don't let it fool you. A lot of time is needed when we're talking about approaching with empathy and really understanding our teams. To me, this step is the most crucial in the process. So if you're implementing new policies or wanting to try, like I said, new tech stacks, there's lots of reasons that we assess our teams and figure out how to continue to grow. Maybe you're reorganizing your team or the organization itself, which I think a lot of companies are going through right now. Whatever the case is, I encourage you to take the time here and use tools to aid you, just as you would with product innovation. We have great visual tools that can be used in this stage, like empathy maps and bento box exercises. And again, I can connect with you after and figure out what tools are going to make the most sense for your needs and goals, but leverage what you have at your hands to really dive deep. In step 2, this is all about defining, and we're taking our insights and defining the problem statement here. This is a key step because much like with product development, this is going to be our North Star and really guide us and our teams as we work through the ideation and subsequent stages of building a solution. We're going to build together with our team our provocative statement of truth that we can test and modify. And notice what I just said, build together with our team. This isn't done with just senior leadership. This is bringing in the team members themselves, or if you're a larger organization, at the very least, diverse representatives of each team. So the perspectives and the POVs of our people can be reflected. This starts with synthesizing our information so we can identify what the problem is that we actually need to solve for, and includes the team members that impact. So there's two sides of the perspective being provided here. And the key elements of defining our problem is that we stay focused on the people, not the technology, not the revenue, for example, which can feel counterintuitive because we do ultimately want to arrive at a place where there is a tangible solution and our business is growing. But we have to start with the people. And the problem statement should also be broad enough to be creative without too many limitations, but narrow enough to be manageable so that it's practical enough to be implemented. And you can use tools like Empathy Map here as well, or How Might We exercises to arrive at what it is that we want to solve as a team. The information that we gather from these exercises can translate into the problem statement itself, which should speak to the team, the need, the insight. And I have an example of what that could look like as a leader here on the screen. So what is it that we want to solve for? Virtual employees need a way to feel connected to executive and peer teams because they spend a large amount of time off camera. We have Zoom, we're in Zoom culture right now, and end up feeling isolated and in fear of job security. So I think this is a common one that we're trying to solve for as leaders right now. And notice how we're focused on the people and solving the problem for them. That's where it has to start if we want to be successful. So once we've done the most critical work of understanding and taking in new information, now comes the really fun part, when we get to ideate around how we'll actually solve this problem. And there are a lot of techniques out there that we can use, of course. We're all innovators here. We know there's tons out there. Some of my favorites are brainstorming, mind mapping, storyboarding, very, very creative stuff. But there are dozens, and if you want to connect with me after the conference, of course, we can explore what those options can be for you. But regardless of which method we choose, there are key elements to make sure are present. We have facilitators who can help capture the information and keep time so that teams, the people actually doing the innovation, can really focus on creativity. Consider the environment and how it's going to impact that creativity and the freedom to share. Think back to the psychological safety that I mentioned earlier when we kicked off the session. Are you creating an environment where people feel able to share thinking without judgment? Make sure there are clear rules. So, is there a time limit? Are there no phones allowed so there's no distractions, things like that? And make sure it's clear for everyone that there are no wrong or bad ideas so you can enable that creative thinking. Teams should build on one another's ideas and link concepts, not necessarily shut them down without exploring them, right? So let's take a minute. Imagine that it's an exciting time at your company because you've designed a new benefit or a program to offer your employees. You've spent months brainstorming and planning with your executive team or your human capital teams and vetting vendors and building the system itself and then crafting it to perfection. You did all you could do to ensure it was just right with all the necessary features. You tried to ensure that you gave the program design more focus and the communications around it are crafted well, ready to go. The email goes out, the Slack announcement goes out, and it seems to fall flat. The program had maybe a few signups, but somehow the larger team just wasn't interested in opting in or signing up for the program. They seem comfortable just kind of knowing about it and continuing to do business as usual, and are fairly uninterested in the positive sentiment that you've shared, the excitement that you've shared. They're kind of uninterested in it. And it makes no sense to you because you thought, hey, this is a health benefit. As an empathy-driven leader, that's what I wanted to offer. But there you are, months later, having spent that valuable time, the money and the resources, and even attracting a few signups, but not really at scale. So what went wrong? When we execute ideas with a focus for making big changes in the company or the industry, or just completely reinventing the wheel, only to realize at the end of the process that we've been focusing on the wrong thing, that's where prototyping comes in. That's where it becomes an extremely valuable tool for us. Prototyping is this experimental model. I know you guys all know about prototyping, but here we're talking about the model of the solution that we are thinking of implementing that we can use to test and validate. It provides us with a set of tools for exploring these ideas before too many resources go toward implementing. And this is an important step in the innovation process, as I know you guys know. It's just as valuable when it comes to building teams to really avoid implementing solutions at scale that either can create chaos or dysfunction or lose trust with your employees. And here we're looking for goal misalignment. We're looking for errors, opportunities, and gaps to really make sure that we're hitting the mark. Remember, the goal here is not that it's perfect, but rather that it's exploring the real impact of the programs or processes or whatever it is that we're implementing, so we can see how they really work in real time. Now, we want to find a solution that doesn't work. We want to see what could go wrong. So we have to let go of our ego, let it walk itself out the door, and openly seek to understand how well or not our solutions solve the problem for our teams that we've intended them to actually solve. So moving into testing, where we'll be evaluating how well our solution works by asking our teams to experience it. When we're testing the solution, we co-create it. Remember, co-create with our teams, not tell them. The first thing is to make sure that we are doing so in a setting and context that it's actually going to occur in. So our PTO benefit may look really good on paper. Our commitment to asynchronous Slack communication may sound really good in theory, or our perspective on inclusiveness in the workplace may be well intended, but without testing it in the environments they occur in real life, they will likely fall short for our teams. In one of my other talks that I give, I actually explore this phenomenon from a bit of a different lens, but what we get is this hot-cold empathy gap. And the hot-cold empathy gap is actually most commonly discussed in fields like medical decision-making and addiction. And it's the idea that in our cold state, we are operating off of our frontal lobes, which is reasoning and logic. And these cold states is where we develop strategies for how we're going to handle moments when we may want to take that drink in the example of addiction. We'll outline the steps that we want to take, how we'll react, and so forth. But the hot-cold empathy gap says that we underestimate our ability to actually carry out that strategy due to the fact that in those moments, so in our hot states, we no longer operate from the frontal lobe. We operate from the limbic system, which is driven by emotion. And it's this part of our brain that influences how we behave and what that emotional response is going to be. And this is driven by how we make sense of the world. And so when it comes to how this plays a role in our team development, we can create solutions for our teams that make a lot of sense and sound like solid plans. But in the heat of the moment, when the chaos hits or when things don't go as planned, how has our solution been built for teams so that it doesn't fail us in these moments? That's what testing can help us uncover so that we can identify those hot moments, identify those gaps, and create solutions that do work for our teams. So several ways to do this. Diversify the way in which we receive feedback with a mix of observation, recordings, questionnaires, conversation. Talking through feedback can absolutely be a great way to dive deeper and really make sure that you are open to negative feedback. Don't shut down. And as with building a product, same thing with programs for our teams. Testing for both desirability of the solution that you've created and the feasibility to actually implement it within the culture and the demands will be key to your success. And keep in mind, this is an imperfect process. This part is messy. It could take multiple rounds before we get it right, but it'll ensure that you are successful with your teams. And then finally, it's time to put our vision into effect and ensure it actually improves the experience of our employees. This is where how you approach building your program or the solution with your team matters a lot. And that's because there is the law of effect and expectancy theory at play here. The law of effect, put simply, is to say that it is the contingencies and the consequences that actually influence whether we are motivated to put the effort in to do something. So in our case, whether our teams sign up for the benefit or implement a new process that we've designed, there has to be a motivator, whether it's intrinsic, so the reward is the outcome, like it makes them happy or we're making an impact, or extrinsic motivators, so rewards like they get a bonus or more money. Okay, the law of expectancy then adds to this to say that it's not just the motivators, but more importantly, how the person actually views those contingencies and consequences that matter. And that's why that first step with empathy is so important to a successful implementation, because it allows us to build processes and programs for the teams that we lead in a way that speaks to their motivators through their lens, not ours. And like I said, that's an entire training that I work through with team leaders, and it can take weeks and months sometimes. But without that insight, you're solving for solutions in ways that don't matter to the people that are actually implementing them. So taking a step back and considering how your team would answer questions like, if you think you're capable of even implementing the solution well enough to be rewarded, that's where we get this expectancy. Or if you think good performance will be rewarded, that's the instrumentality side of it. Or if you think, even value the reward that's being offered, that's the valence lens that we're adding, right? These are all important factors when we're looking at how we're going to implement. So to wrap it up here, today's session, like I said, is just a snapshot of this framework. There's a lot to unpack, and I believe we only scratched the surface with this. Applying this framework is certainly something that I help leaders do in corporate coaching and training, but I believe that as innovators and leaders, if we start with empathy And we bring people along for the decision making, and we take the time to understand motivations and interests and cultural influences and all these factors that make us who we are as human. If we do that, we will make better decisions for our businesses and for our teams. Think back to the story at the beginning of our session. If my company, if many companies during the pandemic perhaps followed a process like this, do we think that there would have been cost-effective solutions that could have saved some people's jobs? Would there have been a different outcome and reaction if people had been brought along the way in the decision-making process to create those solutions? Maybe. We won't know, but there are so many daily situations that extend just beyond the pandemic where this framework can make a huge difference. And using empathy and design thinking as a framework for leadership, we can make decisions that work better for people. We will make more inclusive decisions that offer goal alignment with our teams, and we will certainly create more motivated environments that affect the bottom line in really positive ways as we transform and renovate our culture and teams. And of course, I'd love to continue the conversation with you. If you'd like to connect with me on social, or my website is ciaraungar.com. I could talk for days about any one of these steps that we breezed through today, but more than ever, we are tasked with getting this leadership thing right for our teams. So it doesn't stop here today. Let's unpack this together so that we can make a positive impact on our teams and the industry.